So what exactly makes an industry interesting to enter? What are the elements that a founder, before they enter, before they even take their first step, can look at in order to decide, do I want to enter this and be a competitor in this space, or should I be looking for a better opportunity? And in the last video, I discussed one of my favorite tools to help answer this question, the Porter's 5 Forces analysis. And today I wanted to do an example of this sort of analysis for an industry I see emerging, namely because I've seen a lot of startups try to create businesses here, which is taking LLMs and use them for private data to give companies access to their internal data using an interface like a large language model to do that. So today what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at that industry. We're going to do a 5 forces analysis talking about all 5 of the different ways you can look at it, competitors inside of an industry, new entrants, substitutes, buyer power and supplier power, and then sit back and look at it and see what does that tell us about the industry? What does that tell us about people who need to compete in that industry and give people the best chance possible to succeed? So looking forward to chatting with you today. So we're going to start this analysis for Porter's 5 Forces for LLMs for private data. Before we get to the actual analysis, I want to actually make it really clear what we're talking about here. And fortunately, this has become popular enough that there are nice graphics out there for this. I'm going to move my head over to the other side. And effectively what this is saying is that we're looking to be able to take what LLMs have today, use it on private data, and then create a vector database or whatever information or whatever to go and produce that for yourself, right? So on the left-hand side, you have the raw data. Based on folks I've met who are doing this, this could be like your documentation database. This could be a bunch of private legal documents. Legal seems to be an area that's starting to light up here, pretty actively. And even just company emails, things like that. You're popping this all into different pipelines, right? You have a pipeline, it goes into a vector database at some point, which allows the LLM to actually read the data better and be able to figure out what the next words are. And then eventually goes through the LLM framework and then goes to the endpoint here. So effectively the type of organization we're talking about, and again, because I'm not talking specifics, right? We're just kind of imagining like the general company that's entering in the space that have their own special mix, various different things they're doing. But fundamentally, this is what they are providing to the organizations, right? So instead of a company building this themselves, they contract out so somebody else collects the data, does the pipeline, does the vector database, puts into the framework and goes into, and allows them to use something like ChatGPT, right? OpenAI is the big behemoth here, but there are other folks that are allowing this. So we're talking about what these organizations look like in the Porter's 5 Forces framework. So we're going to start way here in the center, and usually current rivalries is a good place to start because you just talk about what's the state of the industry, and generally speaking, folks know more about that. So what can we say first off about this industry? Well, one thing that we know is going to be true about this, and I know this just from experience, but even if I was looking at another industry, it wouldn't necessarily surprise, you don't have to have a high level of knowledge to know this. It's going to be lots of startups, highly competitive. So from a personal standpoint, I've met 4 separate organizations within about 4 weeks of each other, basically, in different parts of the world, in different countries, different parts of the world, different cities, different backgrounds, who were all going in there and looked at LLMs and said, oh, we should do this for private data. And they've all been starting up roughly in the last 6 months, right? Some of these folks are aware there's a lot of competition. Some of them are not aware of this. They think they're unique in that, which is unfortunate, but that's just the state of it. So we know that there's going to be lots of startups. There's a high level of competition here, to do this, and you got folks coming in. One thing we will say is that another thing we can look at about rivalry and just thinking about like what are the forces that are going to be true about this is that you do have to have some level of know-how, right, to, get into the space, right? There's lots of folks who have that, but there is a technical barrier, right? And it's like it's just that you have to be technical to begin in this. You have to understand the technology sufficiently well, right? You wouldn't necessarily have to be an absolute expert in it, though longer term you're going to have to be, but at least to get started, because this is a new industry, You don't have to have you don't have to have as much knowledge, but you do have to actually understand how an LLM works, how those details can be put together, how these things interact, how you can set up a vector database. And so a lot of the firms that I know who are entering into this, even though there's quite a few of them, they all have this background where they've been using AI for a number of years. They have experience with the tech stack that's available here. They do understand how these things really interact, and they're familiar with the technology, and not everyone has that. So that's one thing we're going to be talking about here. The next thing that exists here, and this is kind of a benefit to them, right, is that very new industry. No established players. So the reason this is important for this part of the analysis is that we're not talking about something that's existed for the last 10 years, right? We're not going into like competing in SQL databases, right? Even with the big behemoths in the industry, right? Like OpenAI, or like even the open source software out there, and that's available, like, Hugging Face and Minstrel and a few others. There really isn't anyone who's like locked this in, right? Even in the LLM space, which is kind of the technology that made this available, there's not a ton of competitors moving in here. That's why there's so many startups, going in here, because it's not like anyone's got a foothold on this. They have ideas on how they want to get into this. We'll get to that in a second. But at least right now, it's new enough where like somebody can actually get in there and actually do something interesting, right? And that's why there's a lot of folks moving in, because they think they can do that because no one's really well established. And so that's another area on where, rivalry is going to be quite intense. Another factor here that I think is important, that isn't necessarily true for LLMs, but it'll definitely be true for these service providers, if you will, is that there will be a lot of relationship-based, relationship-based selling in this industry. So relationship-based selling to other enterprises. So ChatGPT and OpenAI is doing they're selling to end consumers, right? Or at least end users. You may buy it for your organization, and I've worked with organizations that have OpenAI licenses, but a lot of their current customers come from just end users, right? People like me who are buying it to help with this, with projects like this and other stuff I'm doing. Some people are experimenting with it. So it is really an individual user model. This is not going to look like that. There are going to be some services that have that, but given the nature of, how complex this is, right? You're going to have to understand the raw data you're dealing with. You're going to have to understand the pipeline. You have to put into a vector database. You're not going to be able to scale that out to, a very large number of folks, at least not initially. It's going to look less like Google, more like Salesforce, right? And so that's going to be one of the preeminent forces that kind of, that you deal with, with relationships. And what this means is that if you go into an industry where you're already a tech firm and you already have a lot of established firms that you have relationships with them, you're going to be able to get that sale first, right? And so you're going to be able to be the first one in the door. You'll be able to help them. So for those firms, it'll be a very good thing. If you're a newbie who doesn't have those relationships, who is trying to get off the ground and doesn't have the ability to build it, it's going to look very hard. There's going to be a lot more there. But what this says among rivalry is that when you're doing that sort of relationship-based selling, it actually opens up a lot more avenues for you and what you could do. Because if this were a winner-take-all market, right, like, search engines or OpenAI looks like it's going into, right, the LLM front end, it's going to be a lot harder to make a niche for yourself. It's going to be a lot harder to get that in because the winner's going to come in. The nature of this industry looks like, no, it's not going to be a niche. It's going to be lots of different organizations are going to have lots of different pieces. So the pie can get sliced up into a million different pieces, potentially, right? If you're Salesforce, even though Salesforce took all over the world, they did that by winning every goddamn sale. There was just no way they could have run that business without having that, that ability to have lots of salespeople building relationships and getting those in, then. So it ends up actually being something where I'm not going to say it eases competition, but it makes it much more likely there can be a niche that you can actually win, that you can go into. And so you can't, it was hard to niche down against Google. They just ended up winning, right? Everything. Versus this industry, you can, whittle that in. So depending on how you look at it, that's an interesting force. But this, I think, are the big forces on the rivalry side. Again, if you do your own analysis, you might come up with your own ideas on what's here. But I think this is a pretty good way, at least for a short analysis, we can take a look at what are the forces there. Later on, we'll kind of go and rank these, and we'll see how high or low it is, and I'll give my idea here. But before we do that, let's go up to the threat of new entrants into this industry. So what are we talking about with threat of new entrants? Well, we're thinking about, we have this industry, and let's go forward and let's decide this goes gangbusters, right? And this, every firm is profitable. Every YouTuber is talking about, oh, I created this service-based industry and I'm making, $25,000 a month. I have these big things. Who are the people who are going to be like, that's a good idea, I'm going to enter the industry, right? And what's stopping them from entering the industry? What's stopping them from being able to do that, right? So let's go through here. So as we said below, there is a technical competence here, and it might be that, actually, I'm going to move this one up, actually, because this probably does better as part of the threat of new entrants. There is a technical barrier to entry, and you do actually have to do this. Now, it's a low barrier today, right? And this is how I'll describe it. If you're trying to become the best SQL developer in the world today, the absolute best, you're going to be fighting against people who've been doing this for 20 years. And I mean, if you've ever met a true SQL developer who understands it, they've been doing it for decades, right? And that's the top, right? And it's not even necessarily that they're super rare at the top, right? There's lots of them, because there's lots of people who've been doing this for 20, 30 years or so. And that's who you're competing against. So if you only have 1 year of experience there, it still might be a good move. You still might be able to do something with that knowledge, but it's very unlikely you'll be able to be competitive here. You're not going to start a database shop with 1 year of experience. There's just too many here. Versus with LLMs and a new technology, these have only existed for a few years in the market, really, right? The only companies that have more than a year of experience literally work for OpenAI, okay? Or Bard, or any one of these things, right? And they were largely research teams for most of their history. So there are a few people out there who have this experience. But for the most part, you might think of LLMs as being, in the open market, let's say people not working for OpenAI or one of these organizations, maybe 2, maybe 3 years of experience for the most part. I'm sure there are people who are more, and I can, as I'm saying this, I can realize there's probably some long tail of folks who do actually have a bit more experience. But for the number of businesses that need it, for the demand for people who know LLMs, it doesn't necessarily meet the supply. So if you have a year of experience or 2 years, you can kind of eke your way in, right? If you have 2 years of experience with LLMs, it's much more likely you can start a business around that as opposed to 2 years of databases. So one, there is a technical barrier to entry that you have to hit, and you have to have that minimum. So even a few people on the side who look at that are going to be like, oh, okay, we need to go and start this up and go and, and do this. And they're going to have to find someone who's actually competent in that, right? And there's a little bit of resistance there, but I wouldn't say a great deal here. So 2 is the market attractive today? So we're not saying if it's going to go gangbusters in the future. Now we're kind of looking at it and saying, well, does it look attractive today? And the answer is we're not sure. We're looking on the side and we're thinking, well, it's going to be a service-based business and we're going to have to go out and get a bunch of folks. So I'm going to say uncertain about profitability. So there is an uncertainty on whether or not this is going to be a really good big industry. And so what I'm thinking about here is why haven't are the Goliaths going to move into this industry? Is OpenAI going to move into this industry? And we'll get to that analysis in a second, but it's all going to be based on how profitable it is. Right now, we're uncertain about it. So there may be some big players sitting on the side who have done the back of the napkin analysis and went, I don't know if this is going to fly. Or better yet, if we're going to be working in LLMs and we're going to be masters in this industry and we're trying to win it, well, we're just going to go off and do something else, right? We're just going to go and win that market. Right now, if you're OpenAI and you're looking at this industry, what would be a better use of your time? trying to go in and get those private data and go to every single firm here and try to get them in and figure out what individual industry needs and get the sales force behind it to do this? Or are you just going to try to increase your market share of OpenAI? I mean, we know the answer. They created the ChatGPT store, and they went and created this thing. So it's like, clearly they think, well, if we put a little bit more effort into this train that's already going, we can get a lot more out of it, as opposed to fighting the ground war that is going to be, here. So that is a force you need to take into consideration, that there are new entrants and they're not really certain. So it's not very clear they're here. The counterpoint to that, or at least the threat, is that there are massive players on the sidelines. And this is one of those really almost existential threats to this. This is high. This is massive. Because if it's not very profitable, right? If you're creating service for, or it's like, hey, what if this industry turns into, there are local geos, for example, right, where every city has a service firm that does this, and it's highly fragmented, it's niched down, and they do this, and like, they're profitable, but maybe they're not massively profitable, or not more profitable than just, double the number of users on ChatGPT, or make the store way more profitable, right? That's the side of it. So that math is going to be already there. But if for whatever reason the math changes, that it does end up becoming way more profitable, there are some massive, massive firms. Google, OpenAI, Microsoft, there's other players that have done it. IBM still lurking in the background somewhere, right? We kind of run them off, but they're there too. They've been working in AI for years. They might position themselves to take this. So the fact is that if you are a little fish in the pond here, right, and you're kind of an early startup and doing this, and you get really good at this, you have a massive player that you got to be concerned about. And there's a relationship here that doesn't always exist in the industry, but it does exist here between this and the strength of the suppliers. But we'll get to that in a moment. But because there are massive players on the sidelines here that are looking into this industry, and it would make sense for them to do that, that's a big threat. The other thing too about this is that basically there are players with massive. Actually, I'm not going to turn this into its own, because, well, actually, I will turn this one here. So there are massive players on the sideline, not only from the perspective of resources, but competitors are well capital. Potential entrants are well capitalized. You're fighting Google, right? If this ends up becoming a thing, or you're fighting Salesforce, or you're fighting these other guys, if this ends up being interesting to them, they might go and enter. And so that's worth mentioning. The other factor that's really worth mentioning here is that this is a sexy industry. And this is not a force a lot of people talk about, really. This is not something there. But the opposite of this is that, like, what if this was a boring industry, right? Like, what if this was like insurance? Yuck, right? Or it's like, oh, we're helping some little niche thing in healthcare, right, to do this. Most people really wouldn't pay attention to it, right? Or at least there's not that immediate signal that goes, oh, yuck, I have to get into insurance because that's going to be really cool and that's going to get me on the cover of Forbes and that, right? That doesn't really happen a lot. This is a really interesting industry. It's really sexy. And so there's way more people who are looking at this and going, it's cool technology and it's making people a lot of money and there's all these places I can do this. That means that there's a lot more people on the sidelines than probably should be. There's a lot of people who probably have no business starting this sort of organization, but because it's sexy, because it's interesting, they're going to take a stab at it anyway. That's a threat. If you're looking at this, like, ideally, the ideal industry, if you are a current competitor in this, is somebody who is being someplace where no one else wants to be. You don't want a sexy industry. You don't want to be there. You don't want to do that, unless you happen to have some other significant advantages. For the most part, you want people to just ignore you. They don't have this here. And so your threat of new entrants in this industry are quite significant here. Even though there's a technical barrier, it's not huge. It's not massive, right? somebody can work a couple of years and get up to speed there, which by that point you better have a foothold, right? So, but there's a little bit of there. There's a little step that you have to get through. One of the things is that smarter players may stay on the side because they're uncertain about the profitability, but at the same time, if it ends up being profitable, they might come in and actually make something massive happen. There are well-capitalized players on the sidelines. That doesn't ever look good. And this is a really sexy industry, so a bunch of people who shouldn't be here are probably going to be looking at it because, oh, I'm starting an AI company, right? So that's our threat of new entrants. So next we're going to talk about substitute products in this industry, right? And this is going to be different from the first two because honestly, like LLMs are quite killer as far as a tech is concerned. And I'm somebody who's been using it for about a year or two, and it's one of those where it's like it keeps being a game changer to even people who aren't super tech savvy. I mean, just personally, like I've gotten both my 60 some odd year old parents to start using ChatGPT and Midjourney and all these techs. It's really useful. The current substitutes though are like, like, okay, like if you're a company and you're wanting to do this, well, what are you currently doing? Well, what you're doing, hire people to like do the research for you, right? Like if you're a law firm, what do? You hire people to go and do the research into this into these papers. You hire medical assistants to go and research these things, right? It's a lot of things that like you can just hire people to go off and do that, and it's quite expensive, right? And what they do. So like this is kind of an edge because it can get you a pretty good answer, even with what they say is hallucinations, and even still, like we're solving that problem in a number of ways, not just getting less hallucinations over time, but also sourcing the exact points of data internally, right? So that if a hallucination does happen, you have a cross-check against that. So there's lots of tech around this, but like one of the things is that if I want to go and ask questions, I can just hire people to go and do that for me, right? That's a substitute. Another tool that you have is just use traditional data analysis tools. So like, ChatGPT and LLMs are just an evolution of, well, what are we doing? Well, we're going to do a database search, right? We're going to create a recommendation engine, or we're going to scan all these documents, and I'm going to use traditional data analysis to go and find answers to that, right? And these firms are going to do it for quite a while, right? They're still going to, use those things. The other substitute here on this is, because this is generally a new thing, is just go without it, right? I mean, it's not really a substitute, but it's kind of like a lot of the answers that people go into here is that they're offering new capabilities, right? Where it's like, oh, you can all of a sudden search all this documentation and all of a sudden you can get an answer, or you can get a recommendation based off your documentation and things. And yeah, you have other people, but you can just go without that. I mean, especially with new feature generation, you can just say, I'm just not going to have this additional feature this LLM can offer. I don't want it. Our people don't need a chatbot for their documentation. They don't need a chatbot for their accounting. So a lot of folks are just going to say they're not going to do this. The other threat, and I think this is the biggest threat, because these are rather weak, these three here, because once people understand what it's actually capable of, and we get over that curve where we're moving from visionaries to the main market, it's clear that this is better. It's better than hiring more people. It's better than traditional data analysis tools. It's better than nothing, right? Especially at the cost that we're going to be able to offer this. But people are not used to the technology yet. One of the biggest barriers organizations selling in this industry are going to have for a long time, and this is, I'm going to say for the next 5 to 10 years or so, this is going to be prominent, is they're just not comfortable with the tech. They're going to see the LLMs, they're going to see problems, and this is a war where it's like, it's going to take, for individuals, it could take up to a year for them to really get comfortable. That's kind of my heuristic that I use, where from first introduction to actually legitimately accepting the technology, regardless of how cool it is, it's about a year or so, right? And for them to become really efficient at it, I usually put that another year. So like I put these things at 2-year cycles. So if I'm selling to an industry and I've decided, okay, I'm going to help accountants, that's who I'm going to help. There's a lot of data behind it, and LLMs are the perfect tool to be able to help them. Some firms are going to get it. Some firms are going to have visionary founders or tech people or leaders. And some, you're going to be the first guy showing up saying you should do this. And they're not going to be trusting of it, just simply because it's new, it doesn't help. So, can you build a product that has a killer feature set and has a great price point and does all those things? Absolutely, that's what you're going to do. But that doesn't change the fact that there's a lot of people who still aren't comfortable with it. And they're not going to be comfortable for some time. So, right now, and what we're sitting here, this is not as big of an issue as the other two areas, but it is worth considering this one in particular, and that people will go with this just because they're not comfortable with it. Not massive. I don't know how much it's going to change it. We'll get to that analysis way at the end. But for now, this is what I feel like are what the substitutes look like for this market. Now, I'm going to go through the bargaining power of the suppliers here, because this is really interesting. So, let's go back to this tech stack, right? So we're looking at this and we got things like raw data raw data sitting on one side. We got a pipeline, which there's lots of different pipelines that are out there, right? And when we're thinking about suppliers, we're thinking about all the people that make the product work, right? So you may have like human resources that end up being that, right? Where it's like you need a lot of developers, and maybe use consultants or things like that, right? That's one side. Some of it are tech providers, the people providing the technology for the industry. And there's other forces as well that exist here, right? That you can look at, or different people who are supplying to you, and you look at their power, their power and their bargaining power to be able to demand things. For the most part, most of the technology is pretty established, right? In what you do. Cloud computing is not going to be super massively influential in this. There's there's a few providers, and you can go with a lot of folks, so it's not like that's going to sap technology. Vector databases is interesting. It is not an industry I am as well aware of, but it is starting up. There are going to be some open source options that are available there, but I'm not going to see them as super massively important. A few other technologies we could talk about being there. And but there are, I think, two forces here that I think are worth mentioning. One of them is AI talent. And when we think about starting a company like this and being able to get folks into your industry, one of the things you need, especially as you scale, is, hey, we need talent who knows how to build with these damn things, right? You may have a great idea, maybe a great pitch, and maybe you found that niche or you found that thing that's like, oh, goody, we're out there and we're able to go and help people with this. Well, now you need to get to delivery. And you can look at your stack and it's like, well, you're going to have people who can design software applications. There's lots of folks who can do that. You have good database people, right? But you start to move into vector databases. There's not a lot of people who deal with vector databases. Ooh, and there's even less that deal with AI and this type of AI, right? To be able to build this tech stack. And once you get beyond that first individual who is, hopefully your co-founder building this, you have to start finding that talent out in the world. So what happens? Well, I'll tell you what happened in the Web3 industry, right? Because it's the industry I'm familiar with, and the same thing happened. Ethereum started off, wasn't really well known. Then 2017 happened. It pumped up. We had a whole bunch of different new projects start off, and they all needed smart contract developers. And we didn't have a lot of smart contract developers. So we went to a bidding wars, And it wasn't necessarily like the talent itself was bidding up the price, right? There's some forces like that. They're too numerous. But what ended up happening is they started getting better and better competing offers, right? Oh, I'll give you $250,000 a year to come work with us. Oh, we're going to build this. I'll pay you $350,000, $400,000. The prices went insane. There were some people literally, and this is legitimate, staff level engineer being paid $1 million a year to work for projects. That's what happens when you have a talent crunch. That's what happens when you have a war. I was even walking into people who were talking about, it's like, yeah, I want to work part-time. I'm not asking for much, $350,000 a year for part-time work. That's what happens. So one of the big areas you're going to run into is that you're going to have a tough time getting talent. There's just not enough people in the industry to be able to support this. So either you're working not on the leading edge where your product is just using your suppliers to build, using the suppliers that are there, right? Just using core LLM capabilities and working around that, and hopefully your competitive advantage comes from elsewhere, or you're competing for that talent pool. And yes, people are getting million-dollar signing bonuses to join Google and Facebook and all these organizations, Meta, all these organizations to get paid, and you're going to be in that same pool. You're going to be competing with them. So that means one of your suppliers has a massive advantage. But let's say you don't do that and you decide, well, we're going to avoid trying to go after AI talent directly. We're going to stay within the leading edge, but the leading edge we can pay other people for. Well, what do you have happen? I'm calling this the open AI threat here because ChatGPT is owning the world. It's continuing to do better, and there are other competitors, right? Because we got Google doing their thing. Meta is making a play out here where they have their own open source tools. They have it out. But this is starting to look like a winner-take-all market. And at the end of this is an LLM endpoint for OpenAI. And if it does have the best tool, and it ends up winning, and they ended up being the LLM provider for the world, including you, that gives them massive power to come back and basically level the playing field. We saw this with Google. This is the Google level threat. So back in the day, there were many startups that I was familiar with and worked with that used, for example, Google Maps to do something interesting. And what they ended up doing, this company that I was familiar with, I believe, ended up taking social data from Twitter and mapping it up with Google Maps and basically making a layering where they could start to pinpoint where activity was happening on a map. It was very interesting. Starting to be used by law enforcement. Is that interesting? So they started getting these folks that are out there, and Google didn't really like that. They didn't do that. So what did they do? They changed their terms of service to make it illegal. Or not illegal, but against their terms of service, and they wouldn't supply them anymore. What happened? Startup closed. Another startup that was in the in the Midwest basically heavily relied on Google advertising to monetize, right? That they basically created this interesting tool. They, the model is we're going to provide better traffic to Google, and that meant that they got more profit. So they were able to use Google ads to monetize. And then one day, literally, Google came out with an update. You probably weren't aware of it. Google just came up with an update, and to you, it was just like another day, right? Had a code name, but who gives a shit? Well, they gave a shit because their profitability literally got cut down in half because Google made one change. Twitter did the same thing. Twitter had a fire hose that it had for years where you could basically use the Twitter fire hose to get a whole bunch of streaming data, and people had a lot of exciting startups and different things that they were doing with this. And then Twitter shut down the fire hose. All those startups died. So this is, to me, one of the big existential threats of the industry. It's early days because we're not exactly sure if they're going to win, right? Because this, for example, if Meta comes out with an open source competitor that ends up being better, and seems like Zuckerberg is intent on doing that, and he has the ability to do it and the funds to do it and all that stuff, he's going to go out and do this. If Apple ever gets its shit together and decides it wants to be in the AI game seriously, that could be another threat, right? Where OpenAI doesn't necessarily win. So this is to be decided. But if they end up becoming massively popular and they end up winning the majority market and they have the best LLM and they have the best tools, they can start making demands. That they can change terms of services. They can decide that because you're selling to enterprise, so we had this pricing model, but you're different. You're a business. And so you're in this other tier where you're paying 3 times as much. What are you going to do? You can't stop that. You can threaten and say, oh, we're going to use this, that. But if they're the winner, they're going, we don't care. They could just flat out refuse to serve you. They could just look at you and just decide, no, we're not going to do that. And you can sue them. You can try to do a whole bunch of other stuff and take it legally, but they're so powerful it doesn't matter. To me, this is one of the big threats that sits here behind it. That if OpenAI actually ends up winning and a lot of organizations use that tool specifically, and there's not enough diversity or the other tools just aren't good enough, they don't even have to enter this industry to get the profits out of it. They can just make a change on their end where they're sucking out all of the, they're sucking out all the profit just by raising prices, changing terms of services, and doing the other things they do without even entering the industry. And they end up taking it more from them. So the profits go from here to here, or whoever the big winner is in this space, right? And so from that perspective, there's two here. Let me take a look at my notes here to see if there's any other thing. Yep. This is really the big two. I'm sure we could think of others, but between these two, that is a lot of money flying out of the industry because just because you need the AI talent and you need the supplier to do this. So that's that side. And finally, we're going to talk about the buying, power of, the buyers here. And this is really industry specific for this particular group. When I originally did the analysis, this was looking at, like, if you're selling to folks like the U.S. government, for example, right? And you have that, obviously, they're going to have a big say in what they do, and the government is really good at knocking you down. But you may also go to industries like accounting firms, for example, or highly diverse industries, right? Where there's lots of different accounting firms in the world. There are lots of different firms. There's lots of law firms that are out there that want to have this technology. There's lots of hospital systems and medical systems, right? And so I'm going to put down that varies depending on the niche. But one of the things that they do is that, depending on the niche, there'll be different capabilities they have. But a lot of these folks are not going to be super tech savvy. And I feel confident saying that because enterprise tends to lag behind on the tech train on what they do. There's not a lot of organizations on the leading edge. There's not a lot of folks there. And like, the more successful your industry is, the more successful your business is, the less likely you will be to start experimenting with these new techs in the first place. And even if you're experimenting with it, it doesn't necessarily mean you're experimenting with them in the right way. And so when I say they're not super tech savvy, even if you take a tech firm, like take an Oracle or an IBM or whatever, they may be pointed off in the wrong direction just because their customers aren't necessarily demanding LLMs today. And then all of a sudden one day, we need LLMs. We need these things. And even though they're a technology firm, they may not be on the leading edge. And so they need to buy your service. They need to buy this thing here. And that could lead to acquisition offers, which is why a lot of these firms get acquired. It could lead them to just buying. They might be able to pit down the price, but honestly, based on this analysis down here where the product is quite good and they don't really have the ability to do it in-house, they're just not going to have it, right? And that's even true I'm not even talking about big firms will have that. Little firms have no shot of getting this right, just because they're not going to have the technology. So they're going to be pretty reliant on the buyer, or they're going to be pretty reliant on folks in this industry to give them the sort of give them the sort of data they want. So depending on the industry you go into, if you're serving like only massive banks, for example, right, that could be reasonable. They may have a bit of bargaining power, but I don't see it, coming out there. Like if you sell to the U.S. government or state governments, for example, they always have more extreme bargaining power. But this isn't just true for them. This is not a service that will only be used by government entities. It could be used by universities. It could be used by law firms. It could be used by small businesses that just want to make administrative work better. So there's a lot of variety in the industry, right? So I'll put that there as a niche here. High variety in the types of clients. So that in this particular case, if one industry ends up doing better than another, like you're not locked into one industry. You're not only serving bakeries in this particular case. You might decide to niche down in there that for whatever reason, bakeries are a ridiculous example, but like this little niche ends up doing better. It doesn't mean you have to be there. It just means this is the most profitable for me. This is the best thing for my organization. I'm solving a problem that actually makes sense. But if it doesn't work out, you can pivot to another industry, which for many technologies, that's not always true. You can't necessarily pivot. So this is out for the general folks. So let me take a look at my notes here. Yeah, and so really when it comes out, this isn't going to be super high up as far as the threat here, because you can move around depending on that you have there. You're not going to be super tech savvy in this space, and this over time will become more and more important, right? On what happens. But like, I don't see this as a major threat. So we're going to go through and rank these. I'm going to start bottom up here because it's bottom is easier. So the threat of substitutes for products and services. So our ranking is just very low, low, medium, high, very high on this. As far as how much of a force does it have on the industry profitability overall. So the threat of substitutes here, I'm going to mark as a 2 low. And the reason it's low overall, and let me get this size down. The reason this one is low is that one, the substitutes are not very attractive in the face of AI. And if people recognized this today and they were well adapted, I would feel it's a 1. That it wouldn't actually be that high. But like, you can hire people to do research. Well, people are expensive and computers are cheap. Even with the highest, the most expensive version of an LLM you can get today, right? And how much you spend on that, it's still cheaper than hiring an additional person. If you have 10 people and you can use an LLM to get you down to 7, right? And you're paying them $50,000 a year, that's $150,000 a year you could potentially save. Because you just don't need all that extra work anymore. You can do the same amount of capacity. Or you can keep the 10 people and serve twice as many customers because they're all twice as effective. Whenever you're replacing people, or replacing manpower, I should say, it's always better. Traditional data analysis tools can't do the things here. You can go without it, but as your competitors start to use this, you're going to have to get on the train. The only real threat here is that people are not used to the technology yet. If they were used to the technology, this would be much lower, but that's going to be a barrier for pretty much everyone going into this. So because of that, I personally rank this as a 2. It's not going to have a huge impact on the industry. This one over here, the bargaining power of the buyers, it's a high variety type of the different clients that you can serve. You can move around quite a bit. You may niche down, and I think the winners in this space will be niche businesses that have some sort of, that have a very specific competitive advantage. We'll get to that in a minute. But because you can move around, because you serve lots of people, and you're naturally just going to people who are just not super tech savvy, and more importantly, they're going to start to get this aspect that this can save us a ton of money. I'm going to put this as a 1 very low. And there you go. Where it's that your bargaining power is just not incredibly strong here from these guys, particularly if you can get the technology and move in. So I'm going to move on to the outside here. Threat of new entrants. I'm going to start off by saying this is a 4 high. And honestly, the reason for this is because there's a technical barrier to entry, but I would say it's more minor in nature. Again, we're in a state where developers are self-teaching at a much higher rate. The education system and I mean by the education infrastructure, right? Like online education, courses, boot camps, things like that, cater to folks who want to move around. And let's not forget that people just tinker like crazy. And this might be a big enough opportunity where people are going to start tinkering and start playing around. So yes, it's going to take time to get people here, but we've done this before. We know how to do it. It's a solved problem where we know we do this. We're just a few years behind here to be able to get the right talent. So there is like a minor barrier to entry. It's not massive though. And really, the fact that there are massive, massive players on the sidelines who are very well capitalized means that there are big players who will look at this and they know we want to be an AI. We know there are different places here. And by the way, this is an obvious idea. Like, this is not like some super secret thing where no one thought of this before. This is obvious in its approach, and there's not a lot of people. So the only thing that's really stopping them from moving in right now is that it hasn't proven to be super profitable. And what I mean by that is that there are better AI plays right now that take bigger chunks of money, right? That are going to bring in more revenue, that are more profitable, besides going to war in these individual industries, because that is what this is about. This is a service-based industry. It's going to be relationship-based. So that might push them away. But that's on the top end, right? So the well-capitalized guys, I imagine, will sit on the side unless they can find, like, the profitability. But because this is super sexy, you're going to have, for lack of a better term, a lot of people who shouldn't be in this industry entering it because it's AI, there's LLMs, we can do permission data, and I have 3 clients I can already sell this to. It means you're going to have competitors here. And it doesn't matter if it's a bad idea. If you have 100 people going towards the door, 1 or 2 of them may accidentally figure it out. Even if, and I'm assuming folks who don't belong in the industry but just got lucky, right? Out of 100 people, 1 of them's going to get lucky. Maybe 2 or 3 of them get lucky just because of where they ended up, what they worked on. They found the right venture capitalist to fund them, and they found the right tech, and they found the right messaging. It can happen by luck that they do well. Problem is, your company is competing against those guys, and if you have enough of them, 1 of you is going to get lucky. You may think it's a competitive advantage, you may think you have this, but the truth is they just might fall into the wrong place. So because of this, because of the massive, well-capitalized player that are just waiting to see the profitability here, are like, yeah, we think it's going to be really profitable and move in, and it's OpenAI included in that, and a bunch of really small players who are too dumb to realize that it's not a good business, it's not going to be a very good industry, it's going to be highly competitive, we're the only folks here. It makes it high that the threat of new entrants is going to push a lot in this industry and make sure that there's a lot of existing rivalry. I'm going to do this one finally. Bargaining power of the suppliers. This is pretty massive. I'm going to put this at very high. I'm not sure about that. I'm not committed to that one yet, but I feel like that's moving in the right direction. Because on the 2 ends, you're going to have to find the right AI talent to move into this industry, and you're just not going to be able to find it. It's not there. You're going to be contracting with consulting firms who can do this, and they're going to charge a high rate for the services they offer. You're going to have to find individuals who can do this, and they're going to be charging a very high rate, which means that you're just going to have to pay them more. Somebody who, in a fair market, might be worth $200,000 a year, because you can't find them, might now all of a sudden be $400,000 or $500,000 a year. And what happens if you got to hire 5 of them? It's $2.5 million you got to go and spend every year to make sure that those folks are in there. If you're paying each one $500,000, which is not atypical in this industry, that's going to suck away profit from the business, which means that you're going to have less profit to spend on competing, building relationships, all these other things. And if you don't do that, you're going up against OpenAI or whoever your supplier is that actually is providing this LLM. I personally think that they are most likely to win this. They're in pole position right now. And if somebody else ends up making a competitor to them that ends up doing, I think they will win instead. I think it's a winner-take-all market where there's going to be 1 or 2 major competitors. And if you're the biggest one, you're probably going to own something like 70% of the market. That's where I'll figure. 50 to 70% might be reasonable. Maybe even more, though honestly, there's enough tech giants out there that I don't think you'll get into I'm betting that they're not going to get into a Google situation where they own like 90%, or an AWS situation where they're like 90% of the market. I feel there's enough competitors in this space that won't happen, but I could be wrong. But even if you own 70% of the market, you may be dealing with those pressures. So because of those 2 things, I put this personally at very high, that they're just going to suck all the oxygen out of the room. And I think that's a big threat to the to this industry. And then finally, rivalry among existing firms. It's not a very well-established industry right now, so there's a lot of players. There are lots of startups, so you're going to be bumping shoulders with a lot of folks. And don't forget the sexy industry, so you're going to get a lot of people who shouldn't be here just sucking oxygen out of the room, right? The one thing I will say, though, is that this will be a very relationship-based selling approach to enterprises and organizations. And I see this as quelling the competition a little bit. Where, if you don't have relationships, you're going to have a lot of trouble selling. Because you're going to have to go in, you're going to have to relationship sell, you're going to have to show the value proposition, you're going to have somebody who knows how to build those relationships, somebody who knows how to deal with longer sales cycles, somebody who knows how to deal with that. And again, that isn't necessarily rare. Like, you can find folks like that who do this. But it does create this barrier where even if there are massive competitors out there, if you have a good job building relationships and you can build that as a competitive advantage, you might actually succeed here. You might do well. So you can kind of niche out your box and do that. But the problem is, from a pure profitability standpoint, I wouldn't say that's necessarily an existential threat, but it does limit your growth on what you can do. Like, the best firms are going to be those who build good technology with a massive sales organization that can go out into the world and start taking away share. But again, that's a lot of, they're taking inches away from their competitors. It's trench warfare, basically, to be able to get people out into the world to do this. And if you want an organization that has done this, HubSpot is a great example of an organization that had to do this. Or Salesforce, trying to go out and compete and get, go inch by inch. Like, they have huge businesses. So they have huge businesses that rely on building one-on-one relationships to be able to scale, which means that you're not going to collapse if you get it right, but it's also something that's never going to take off in that J curve, right? That you're never going to hit that point unless something fundamentally changes, which based on this, I don't think it will. So pretty much on this, I'm going to put this as a highly competitive, unestablished. I'm going to put this as a 3 today. And I could be, if somebody was sitting here arguing against me, I would say you could convince me that it's a little bit higher, but the fact that it's not a new industry and that you can actually build relationships in here, because here's the thing, if there was no barrier to relationships and it was a winner take all, this would be much higher. Instead, if you have a few relationships you can build and you can learn that, that's a way you can compete in this industry, even if it is highly competitive. If you didn't have that barrier, it would just be, you're done, right? You're fighting Google at that point. So that's what the analysis looks overall. So if we're looking at the whole picture here of everything that's going on, we're starting to get an idea of where's the problem. That's ultimately what this is about, right? Is this a good industry, and where are the problems going to come from? When we look at bargaining power of the buyers, I rank that as very low, and threat of substitutes as relatively low. It means that this is a better product. You're not going to find good substitutes for this, right? Other than just pure ignorance and people not wanting to move over, which you'll get a lot of that, but eventually they'll win over to this. This is just a better technology. And there's so many industries you could potentially move into. You're not just fighting for dentists here, right? Or everyone has to go after dentists because it's the only thing that works. No, you can go after everyone, right? So there's a lot of variety. It means that there's not a lot of, bargaining power there. But the really big threat is that it's really from the potential of new organizations to come in here, the big massive threats of OpenAI and Microsoft. It's a sexy industry, so there's a lot of little guys going there. So the fact is you're going to get a lot of people flying into this industry. And you have more competitors, which means that you're going to have to compete on, either do a better job marketing and position yourself, which costs money to do, time and resources, or you compete on price, which means that you lower how much you're making, which means you're making less money per client. It means it's sucking out the profit out of the industry. You're just going to have to deal with more unless you can do something unless you can find that competitive niche. But in both cases, you're going to have to be spending more to make that work. You have a lot of competition. I know that from experience, just there's lots of folks wanting to enter this industry. It's an obvious idea and seems to make sense. It's so new, it's not like there's going to be winners there, right? So everyone's still kind of staking out their land. So there's still lots of places to have winners here, right? And because it's relationship-based, they will have a place where there will be local winners. There will be people who actually go out and do this. And we don't know. Maybe it's by industry, maybe it's by geo, maybe it's by some other factor we haven't thought about. But there is going to be decent competition, at least right now. And if it gets really profitable, this is going to skyrocket. This will maybe turn into a 4 or 5 once these guys come off the once the Goliaths come off the sidelines and come into this industry. But then we have the bargaining power of the suppliers. And I see this as one of the biggest threats here, which is you're going to be paying a ton for the right talent. And OpenAI is going to have such a massive say in what this industry can and can't do. OpenAI could kill the industry if they wanted to, or they could take all the profit for themselves. If they're the number one LLM provider and everyone's providing their own data, they could charge so much that they just accrue that to themselves, right? That to me seems like an existential threat. So, 2 questions. Should you enter this industry if you have a good idea, right? Or whatever. So let's assume you're sitting on the sidelines, you're one of these guys that looks into this, and you want to go in here. It's always going to depend. And a good mission and a good reason for existing can overcome a lot of these things. It's a tough road, right? Because I'm telling you, this is a tough road. Like you should not, like, usually one of these being very high is not a good thing. We got one that's very high and then another one that is high on there. We just happen to have it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But honestly, I could be convinced this is a 4, right? So you got 2 high, 1 very high, which means that this is a hard life. Like if you were looking at me and you're telling me, Brian, I want to start a company that does this thing here, and I'm going to this, and I have clients who are talking to me about this, I would say you got to be real damn careful here. You got to make sure you have some sort of competitive advantage that you're able to play in. And again, one of these companies actually does. I'm not going to say what it is. And it's not technological. It's actually more to deal with this relationship base where it's like, okay, you actually have these 2 things going here to make this work. So if you're not convinced to enter this industry and you're like, hey, would you consider this? No. If you want to do this, there are better ideas. There are different areas that you can do that I think would make sense. We're not going to talk about them right now. But if I would say, just based off this knowledge, would you go in? No, there's a lot of forces, and without a really strong mission and a good reason why you should be in this industry, good advantages, and something that maybe changes the math here, you're going to have a hard life. If you're competing in this industry and you're like, I'm convinced I need to be here, Brian, what do I do about this? It's really on those relationships. Get the tech to some baseline. Do not compete on the technology. Just do not compete on the technology. What I mean by that is there's a certain set of capabilities that you are going to have out of the box with the LLMs, and you can tweak those, right? You're going to be able to tweak those things. It's not like the LLM is going to be there, but like you can prompt it in different ways. You can create different database types or whatever. But there's advantages outside of the AI work that you can do that will help you actually compete in this, in this industry, right? I would not create a competitor based on the technology. I would create it based on my strength of my relationships, right? And I would pick one niche that I thought I could actually really hunker down on. I would just pick one, right? Could be lawyers, could be accountants, could be medical offices, family offices, right? Investor offices, whatever. And I would pick that, and I would I would find a person who's either in this, or it would be ideally an industry you're already a part of. And I would niche down and I would figure out who all the buyers are for this technology, find the CTOs, find the directors, and build it, and build a product just for them. Build it just for them. And, because there's a general pipeline here that you can go into, but there's going to be specific things that are true about their industry. Not all of it is going to be the LLM based. LLM could just be one feature about it. You want to build in hard into like what's going to make their life easier, right? And you can have a UX advantage where you understand lawyers or doctors or whoever so well, you can build this out and build something great. So I would look for a niche that you could actually go and be one of the first ones in. I would get the best damn salesperson you knew how to and build those relationships like crazy. They need to be your best buddies. You need to have a product that is competent, but I would not compete on anything that would move you into the area of needing a ton of AI talent. 1 or 2 people, not a problem. If you need an entire team of these guys, you're going to get bled to death, right? The final thing I would do is you can't get around it today because the open AI threat isn't a today threat. It is a tomorrow threat if they win. I would go and make sure the technology is interoperable, that you can replace OpenAI and whatever the LLM is doing with some other technology that they can go into and actually, and it still works. You can use Menstrual, you can use something from Hugging Face, you can use, Llama 3 from Meta, right? That you can replace it and it still works. Because if you get tied down to OpenAI, you're basically asking them to completely take your industry. Just take our product and take what we do. So those would be the 2 major advantages. The right company is going to be niched down in one area, building incredibly strong relationships with whoever is in that industry, building a software product that doesn't rely on the LLM as the main feature, right? That you're building great UX, great design, handles a workflow for them incredibly well, whatever it is. And the LLM happens to be a great feature in there to be able to do this, right? You're good at taking data for them, cleaning it up, all things that don't compete on that AI on the AI spectrum. And build a competent product and go to market there and just win that. Because something's going to happen that's going to trigger these guys up here, the mammoths. You're going to get a ton of small guys who are just going to keep fighting in here until they do they build this up. And you're going to have OpenAI eventually come in and say, thanks for all the money. Here, I'm charging you twice as much now because, we can do that. That's what I would recommend. So, anyway, I hope that was interesting to you. We went about an hour here to go through this. I will go and save this off and create an image of this, and I'll kind of throw this in on, a LinkedIn post and other places so you can kind of review this. Again, you might come up with a different analysis. This was my own on this industry based on what I've seen. But honestly, the benefit of this is that small factors could change this. Maybe there's something I didn't think about or didn't research right that could make one of these much higher or much lower, depending on what you think. But this is a great tool to start aiming and viewing how to think about this industry and how to think about the forces that are at play here. I feel we got at least a lot of the big ones out of the way, but there's always a better analysis you could potentially do. So anyway, folks, thank you very much, and I will talk to you all later.